They were in charge of what's called the Research and Development Branch, who is in charge of making the secret weapons disguises, documents, forged documents, that kind of thing to equip secret agents. So it's the scientists who were doing all those, creating all those things.
How did you come across that story? That was your first book, but how did you even start to research that? What was the first thread?
That is a good question. The historian in me kind of looks back on the past and, even with these books, thinks, how does anything really come together? As soon as you identify the cause of something, it's like, well, that was caused by something else that is just as integral. So when I look back on my own history, I think, well, I can tell the story of how I got interested in the dirty tricks department. I was, reading, I think I might have been reading John Marx's The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and he mentions Stanley Lovell in there, the main character of this book. And I think that's kind of how I learned about it. And since then, I guess he's been in the back of my mind. When I was in grad school, I was doing my dissertation on some scientists who had connections to the intelligence community. So
you did your dissertation on that?
Yeah, not on that book, but it was a separate topic related to that.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so I think I've always in the back of my head has been an interest in scientists in the intelligence community. And then I also had the knowledge of, there's this one guy, Stanley Lovell, who did some interesting things. And so somehow that kind of came together, and I thought, I'm going to write a book about this.
Who was Stanley Lovell?
He was a Boston chemist. And
that's a bad start, Boston chemist. Take your fucking chemistry set.
Yeah, and he got, during World War II, basically recruited to join the OSS. He was pretty close with this guy named Vannevar Bush. I don't know if you've heard of Vannevar Bush before.
Never.
He was kind of the unofficial science advisor to FDR during World War II. He's the guy who kind of told FDR really about the potential for an atomic bomb. People like to talk about this letter that Albert Einstein wrote to FDR saying, the Germans, that's not really what got the project started. What really got the project started is the British had this committee, the MOD committee, and they wrote a report about the potential of uranium to have some kind of nuclear chain reaction. And the important thing about the MOD report was saying that you don't need a ton of uranium to do this. It's possible to do this, with enough uranium that you could actually isolate U-235,
Wow.
And so Vannevar Bush got a hold of this MOD report and was pretty nervous about it. And so he's the one who approached FDR during World War II saying, we might need to do something about this. So that really got FDR to start this program.
And he was connected to Lovell how again?
Yeah, he was also from New England. And so they kind of knew each other. They were both scientists growing up in that milieu.
Got it.
So Vannevar Bush was also friends with William Donovan, who was the head of the OSS.
Yeah, Wild Bill. Yeah.
Wild Bill Donovan, exactly. And Donovan was looking for someone to lead the research and development branch, to create the secret weapons and documents, disguises, that kind of thing. So Vannevar Bush suggested you should hire this guy, Stanley Lovell. So that's how Lovell got the job.
And so during the war, obviously in the middle of all this is what we all know, the Oppenheimer creation of the bomb. But there was all kinds of other stuff going on because you're dealing with Nazi Germany that was experimenting with biological weapons. They had an insane rocket program and stuff like that. So some of these scientists that you were looking into, whether it be Lovell or some of the other ones, what were the other important things that we kind of miss in history that they were, involved in missions for related to science during the war?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that attracted me to this story is that it's a lot of the projects that Lovell in particular is working on are very absurd. So it's kind of naturally not a funny story because what they're doing is not really funny, but it's so absurd that it is kind of humorous, like what they're doing. For example, you might have heard of the concept of bat bombs during World War II. We're going to strap incendiary devices to bats and release them over Japan. The idea behind this was that, instead of dropping incendiary bombs that, they're not targeted. They just land wherever they land. The wind can blow them one way or another.
Yeah.
Bats will roost in buildings. And so if we drop this over drop a bunch of bats who have napalm strapped to them over buildings, they're going to roost inside the buildings and we can time delay the napalm to explode. And so this will be like a targeted attack. We can directly hit their cities with this incendiary devices. That's the kind of thing Stanley Lovell was doing. That never actually went into the field, obviously. However, there were some field trials with it where Stanley Lovell, he got this guy named Louis Pfizer, who was a chemist at Harvard. Pfizer had invented napalm. So this is where napalm comes from.
Is that the
Pfizer? I don't know if it's the Pfizer that the company's named after.
That's a hell of a coincidence, but keep going.
But yeah, so Pfizer invented napalm while he was at Harvard. In fact, when he was inventing napalm, he would go to the Harvard soccer field and detonate his bombs. That was just where he would practice doing this. But Lovell, of course, thought that was great, and he recruited Pfizer to join the R&D branch. And so he challenged Pfizer, I need you to invent a napalm device that's small enough we can attach to a bat. So he did that. Meanwhile, Lovell got some bat experts to capture some bats from Carlsbad Caverns and elsewhere and round them up. And, they did some tests on this. And during one of the tests, you had to cool down the bats so that they would kind of go into an artificial hibernation state so that you could put them in the planes and transport them. So they were doing this over a desert. They cooled down the bats, they put them in the plane, but they cooled them down too much, and when they dropped them, they just never woke up and they plummeted down into the desert. So that was how one test ended. Another test was, even more destructive. They were doing live tests with these bats. They attached one of these napalm bombs to it, and they had put it in this hibernative state, and they were taking some pictures of it, but it woke up too quickly, and it started flying off, and it actually flew into a barracks and into a control tower. Some other bats flew into a control tower. They detonated and burned it all down. So it actually worked. The weapon did work, but we never used it. By the time that it was kind of finished, the atomic bomb was ready, and so there was really no need for it.
Ended things.
Yeah.
When you're looking at through the lens of something like that, where they're working on all these things during the biggest war in the history of the world, right? And there is, nothing's ever perfect, but there is certainly an aspect of good versus evil there. You have two regimes that are just, you want to talk about like human rights abuses between the Nazi Germans and obviously in Japan, what was going on there. And it's like, these tricks we're doing almost seem like crazy and psychotic to a lot of people, but through the lens of studying it, do you ever like weigh the morality of what we're doing versus the loss of not doing that, if you understand what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point, because one of the main things I initially wanted to do in my first book, The Dirty Tricks Department, about Stanley Lovell, I actually wanted this to be a book about Stanley Lovell and Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of MKUltra, because what they were doing was really, really similar to each other.
And then your publisher said, that's 2 books.
Well, yeah. It wasn't my publisher who said that. I actually got the advice of some other professors at UT, kind of asking them, and they thought, this might make more sense as two, so I split it up. However, the similarities between them are kind of uncanny. During World War II, Stanley Lovell in the OSS is developing these secret weapons, documents, disguises. He's also doing truth drug experiments. So he's using mostly like marijuana. He's, getting soldiers this marijuana and
giving them weed to try to get
giving
the truth?
them weed to see if it'll lower their inhibitions and maybe he can get them to admit things. So there are these truth drug trials going on. He's also involved in plotting assassination attempts on foreign leaders. Okay, during World War II, how can we kill Hitler? What can we do to sneak a weapon in there somewhere and kill him? Or this is one of the crazier stories, but one of his ideas was that he was going to take some female sex hormones and get the gardener who works close to the eagle's nest where Hitler often was, and we're going to inject some of these hormones into the vegetables that Hitler eats, and then these vegetables, they're going to wind up on Hitler's plate. He's going to eat them, and then it's going to like alter his masculinity. He's going to start growing breasts, and he's going to become feminine, and somehow that's going to win us the war.
He starts crying and getting emotional. There's too much death.
But so those are the kinds of things that Lovell is doing during World War II, during the Cold War, and so that's during a hot war. Yeah. This is during the most destructive war in history. During the Cold War, Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MKUltra, is doing a lot of that same stuff. He's involved. He eventually becomes the head of the Technical Services Division, which is the division within the CIA that's responsible for creating weapons and gadgets, just like Stanley Lovell was doing. He launches this MKUltra program, which was trying to develop truth serums, just like Stanley Lovell was doing during World War II.
Very parallel.
And so I kind of knew in the back of my mind, what they're doing is so similar, surely there's like a connection between them. And so that's what I wanted originally the book to be. I want to, compare these two people and show how what they're doing similar and see if there's some kind of connection. I eventually found a connection, but I split it into 2 books. The way the first book ends is basically a brief description of MKUltra and alluding to Sidney Gottlieb, and the second book picks up with Sidney Gottlieb and then briefly referring back to Stanley Lovell. One of the great things about this new book, Project Mind Control, is that the sources that I'm using for it to talk about MKUltra are a series of depositions that I found that run to, Sidney Gottlieb's depositions alone are about 800 pages. And this was part of a lawsuit that the victims of MKUltra sued the CIA in the 1980s.
80s.
Yeah, about 79 is when it started, but it went into the 80s. And as part of these lawsuits, the lawyers who were representing the plaintiffs, Joseph Rao and James Turner, they took the depositions of basically everyone involved: Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, all their underlings who were working for them, and also the victims of some of these MKUltra subprojects. So you have both perspectives. There's a court reporter in there, word for word, verbatim, typing what they're saying. So I have 800 pages of interviews of Sidney Gottlieb, him telling what he's doing.
You imagine being that court reporter? Like, what the fuck?
Well, one of the great things, I interviewed the court reporter for this book.
No way.
Yeah, I found her and interviewed her, and I sent her the depositions after the fact to see, hey, do you remember, can you tell me, like, what was the ambiance in there? What was it like? Did he talk more than, other people or less? And she said he talked way more. I couldn't believe it. Like, usually when you get into a deposition, you want to just say kind of what you have to, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But for some reason, she says Sidney Gottlieb just kept elaborating. And then I interviewed the defense attorney who was representing the CIA for Sidney Gottlieb, and he said the same thing. He said he was a terrible witness because he wouldn't shut up. He is not the kind of person you want. So what ended up happening with these depositions, those lawsuits were settled out of court. And so they never got submitted to the court. So they wound up in the papers of Joseph Rao, this attorney who was on the case. And he passed away, and his papers got donated to the Library of Congress.
There wasn't a gag order on them or anything? Like there wasn't a confidentiality agreement upon the settlement?
About the settlement, no, because the plaintiffs, they walked away with $750,000. That wasn't confidential. It came out.
That's it?
Yeah.
That's all they got?
Yeah, split among them, and there were about 8 or 9 of them.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So yeah.
They got to fuck you on the way out the door.
yeah, and there's actually several of the children of the people who were part of one sub-project. Their children are currently trying to sue, I don't know if it's the Canadian government or whatever, Sub-Project 68, Ewen Cameron, his stuff. The children of the victims of that are still currently trying to sue them for
what was that sub-project? What? I never heard of that.
It's Ewen Cameron was this psychiatrist up in Montreal, and he was sponsored by MKUltra for several years. He was trying to, independently of MKUltra, he was trying to determine whether he could cure all mental illness. He wanted to break a person down to basically a blank slate. His theory of mental illness was that he was a behaviorist, so he thought that all behavior is the result of learned patterns.
Yes.
From your environment, you learn everything that you do. And so if we could break those learned patterns, we could teach you how to behave in a proper way, and that would cure your mental illness. Why are you schizophrenic? It's because that pattern has been ingrained in you from your environment. So if we could bring you back to the blank slate and give you a new environment, that would build you up to be a normal, non-schizophrenic person.
Meaning, if I'm understanding this correctly, in some ways, you'd kind of have to forget who you are.
Yes.
It's like a reset button on the computer.
Yes, exactly. One of the analogies that's used in a report that the Canadian government did is like almost a telephone switchboard. You unplug the wires, and then you plug it back in their proper places. They've been plugged in wrong, and now you have to plug them back in. So you have to undo them first and put them back in properly. But yeah, so Ewen Cameron, that was his theory of mental illness, where it springs from. And again, the way he thought you would cure this is by inducing enough stress in a person that they forgot basically who they are, they forgot their learned patterns, and they could relearn other patterns. The way he did this, the different kinds of experiments that MKUltra funded, is one of them. The most prominent one he's known for is called psychic driving. This is where you would replay repeated audio messages in someone's ear thousands and thousands of times for hours on end, for weeks on end, and they would listen to this thing over and over and over. The way he found out about this is he was recording one session that he was doing with one of his patients, just a therapy session. And she said something that kind of triggered her to have a negative reaction. I think it was something about, oh, my mom used to tell me when I was young, and then she said it. And so he clipped that quote out of the audio, and he just replayed that over and over. And each time he did, she would say, I don't want to listen to that, turn that off, turn that off. And the more he did it, the more agitated she got. And he thought, maybe this is a way to break a person down, make them listen to repeated audio messages of negative things.
Sounds like torture.
Well, it kind of is torture. So that's one way. Another way he tried to break people down is through sensory deprivation. So he would put cardboard tubes over their arms and, earmuffs over their ears, a visor over their eyes so they couldn't see. They had to lay down in bed with white noises playing. They would be there for weeks. For weeks doing this. Yeah.
What do you feed them?
Well, they would eat, whatever. Occasionally, they would wake up and go to the bathroom and do whatever.
Cardboard off, and
yeah. Well, another thing kind of related to that is he would also do chemical comas. So he would put people in comas for weeks on end. I mean, they would wake up once or twice a day to go to the bathroom and to eat, and then under their pillow, he would play these psychic driving messages, so that in their dreams, he thought maybe this will help break them down while they're in it. Another thing he did, kind of the most brutal of them, was
this just doesn't stop.
It doesn't stop. Electroshock therapy.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So electroshock therapy has been around for a while, but he did it much more intense than basically anyone else and much more repetitions than basically anyone else. And again, trying to break down the brain to some kind of blank slate. And then the idea was that once they were the blank slate, he would play for them positive psychic driving messages that he would record himself. Okay, so now something nice, and he would make them listen to that, and surely that would make them in my image. Basically, it's kind of like playing God with these people. But
I'll say
that was his idea. MKUltra, the CIA's program in mind control, Sidney Gottlieb, the head of it. They're interested in this for obvious reasons. Is it possible to change the behavior of a person through some of these techniques? Is it possible to induce amnesia in someone through some of these techniques? That's what they're interested in. So that's why they were interested in his work.
Can we actually take a step back for a second to get the timeline here? Because, one of the things that I always have trouble thinking about, no matter how much I read this history and what it is the fact that you had this organization, the OSS, basically formed during World War II as a wartime intelligence agency. But after the war, the same people, the OSS exists, and then the same people in the couple years after the war basically just change the name to CIA, maybe add some extra extensions to what they can do around the law, that kind of thing, and create this organization that seems to me like it's almost like we called it the OSS in World War II, but it was basically CIA. Is that first of all, is that fair to say?
It is. The OSS is the precursor to the CIA. Yeah. It's not like the CIA grows out of the OSS. The OSS is terminated, and then the CIA is created in 1947 with the National Security Act. But you're right. It is a lot of the same people. In fact, if you just look at a list of CIA directors over the years, a lot of them came from the OSS for for a lot of the first few decades of the CIA. Yeah. They're just directly from the OSS.
Right. So, the reason I bring that up is when you look at the history of, say, Alan Dulles, let's pick on him for a second. He and his brother John Foster actually had long business relations from the private sector before OSS with Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was a burgeoning economy, so they had some business as corporate lawyers there, which, as crazy as that sounds, almost makes sense for a minute, just because they were such a big economy at the time before the world was taking them seriously as what they really were. But when they went to war, when you read these accounts, whether it be Devil's Chessboard by Talbot or other ones I've read, research done by Henry Abbott, and who sourced a lot of things there, it's almost like they went to war well, all right, they declared war on us, all right, we'll go fight the Nazis for you. But they weren't that excited about it. And I say this because what they seemed to always be the most worried about in the back of their mind was the Bolsheviks and the USSR. And they felt like that was going to be, what became the Iron Curtain and stuff like that. And we're going to be in an ideological war, West versus communism in the East. And so they kind of got through World War II as the OSS translated into the CIA. And the mission from the very beginning was, we're in a Cold War now. Let's do the shit that we think the Russians are doing or that we want to beat them to. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's very soon after World War II, or even at the end of World War II, the thinking, especially in the intelligence community, quickly becomes, we need to keep tabs on the Soviets, especially to see what they're doing. And in the case of MKUltra, the idea was that maybe they possess methods of mind control. That's what spurs MKUltra in the first place, is that not even the Soviets, but just communists in general, maybe the Koreans, maybe the Chinese, if they have these methods of mind control, then we should be able to figure out how they're doing it to defend against it. But also, once the CIA starts getting into that, well, maybe even if they're not doing that, we should develop these anyway for our own sake. Yeah, so that's kind of the turn.
You start to that's the thing. This is the downfall of humanity. You may start something for the right reasons because you're well, they're bad, objectively even. We don't want that in their hands. Therefore, we need to learn how to do it. And then once you get a hold of that power, potentially, if you do, now you're well, we're the good guys. We could use it for the right reasons, right? We could be the judge of that, and it becomes this major, major slippery slope. But what was the Did they have, looking back at the evidence that they were using to try to say that like the Soviets had access to those types of powers or whatever, does any of that hold water today, or was it they were just scared and they're like, oh, maybe that's it right there?
Yeah, it's not as if the Soviets or Chinese or Koreans possess some kind of mind control technique that MKUltra was looking for. They thought they did. So originally, what led Alan Dulles to create MKUltra and put Gottlieb in charge of it was the Korean War. There were several pilots who had been shot down during the Korean War and captured as prisoners of war, and they confessed to committing biological warfare against the Koreans. They said, yeah, our planes had anthrax and typhus and bubonic plague and all kinds of stuff, germ bombs, and we were dropping them over the Korean people. And so the thinking in the CIA is, why would these pilots say this? Like, why are they saying this? That's not true. Well, what's going on here? And so the thinking was, they must be manipulated into saying that.
Yes.
The Koreans or the Chinese or whoever must be doing something. What could they possibly be doing? Well, maybe it's hypnotism or drugs or whatever. It turns out that it's, the traditional methods of coercion. They're being tortured, they're having sleep deprivation, they're having food deprivation. Yep. But it's very ironic too, because several of the people who eventually become involved in MKUltra are the ones who figured out that it was like sleep deprivation that's happening to the Koreans. For instance, Jolly West, who he's mentioned in, Tom O'Neill's Chaos. I know y'all know about. He's one of the main psychiatrists who's evaluating these prisoners of war. And, I have a quote in the book where he says basically, there's only one thing that caused these people, to confess to crimes they didn't commit, and it was lack of sleep. And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't sound like anything like MKUltra. And yet it's ironic. It's because he had investigated these Korean POWs that Sidney Gottlieb recruited him, because Sidney Gottlieb thought, okay, well, it wasn't these esoteric methods of mind control, drugs or hypnotism or something that got the Korean soldiers or the American soldiers in Korea to admit to something they didn't do, but maybe that's still possible. And maybe we should see if West knows anything about that. So they recruit him to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we even obviously know now when you'll look at regular criminal cases in the United States that have happened over the years and unfortunately continue to happen, where people will just, they'll be put in a holding interrogation room for a long time, talk to people for a weekend. They're not even necessarily sleep deprived, but there's just psychological fallacies that we are all capable of as humans that lead to some people giving false confessions, things that never happen. Like there's something about being in there and the person they're talking to and the methods of interrogation used that eventually they're like, yeah, no, I did this. And it's really tragic when you see these cases. But I would imagine, in addition to some of the more, I guess, like traditional war crime type methods you discussed, like torture and stuff like that, I would imagine there were probably also guys who maybe gave that up because they're just being interrogated for weeks at a time. And eventually they're like, you know what? I think I did drop typhus on everyone. And they actually believe it.
Yeah. I have no doubt that like false memories could be implanted like that. In fact, one of the things that Jolly West, this guy who is mentioned in Tom O'Neill's Chaos, he's very interested in false memories and trying to induce false memories through hypnotism. The ironic thing, well, he says he is able to induce some of these false memories. The ironic thing for me is that there are a lot of conspiracy theories that kind of come out of MKUltra after the 1970s once it's revealed to the public. People claiming that I was an MKUltra sex slave and the government, did all this stuff. And they said, I have memories of... Yeah. They say they have memories of all these presidents abused me and vice presidents and governors and foreign leaders and all kinds of stuff. None of it's not true. Yeah. But I actually think that they might think that it is true. I think that the memories that they have are not genuine memories in the sense that they experienced it, but I think they think that they're genuine memories. One of the reasons why is because, there's one woman in particular who says that her husband recovered these memories for her with hypnotism. And this is right after the Satanic Panic in the 1980s. And one of the main things of the Satanic Panic is that people were having hypnotism done on them to recover these supposed memories of being involved in satanic rituals where we were sacrificing.
Bring the devil out of you! We're going to bring it out!
Yeah. And so, in fact, her husband, who supposedly recovered these memories, he says that he learned how to recover memories through several people who were involved in recovering memories during the Satanic Panic and got sued for falsely recovering memories of people and lost their medical licenses. One woman claims she won over $10 million in a lawsuit when she sued against him for, doing this to her. One woman claims that one of these guys who was involved in this organization, he implanted this false memory that she had been impregnated by aliens and was forced to abort the fetus and then cannibalize it and all kinds of stuff. And then, the husband of this MKUltra conspiracy theorist, he says, I learned how to recover memories from him. So to me, it's like, I feel like this woman in particular I'm talking about the MKUltra conspiracies, I feel like she's a victim of this. I feel like she's been induced these memories into her, so supposedly recovered them. So I don't blame her that much, but I do think they're not genuine memories.
Right. It's so strange because there's a couple things here. Number one, and this relates to anything, not just like MKUltra claims or stuff like that. The internet allows so many people to say whatever they want, to the point that a lot of people will either say stuff that they genuinely believe because something's happened to them and they're not well, or, say things that just they know patently aren't true. And therefore, it creates like a boy who cried wolf scenario, because there's so much noise of people doing this that the very small, 0.01% of people who maybe are making a claim about X, whatever that is, are actually making a real claim, but they're stuck in all the noise of everyone else. And I can tell you, if I were a gatekeeper to, whatever it may be, whether it's government or not government involved, just a gatekeeper to some sort of nasty secret or something that's wrong that's happening, some sort of conspiracy, if you will, that would be my best weapon. Just a bunch of crazy people saying a bunch of shit, because I'm like, yeah, there's nothing to see here. They're all crazy. And you get to throw out the 0.01% baby with the bathwater.
It's funny you say that, because at the very end of the book, that's the exact point that I make. I make this exact point about how it almost serves, in some cases, the CIA's best interest to have these people out there spreading these lies. I don't know if they actually think they're lies, but I think they're lies. Spreading this misinformation or whatever it is, because it gets trapped in this cycle called censorship through noise, which is what you're explaining. There's so much noise out there.
Yes.
No one knows what to believe. And so we develop a kind of apathy. Well, if there's just too much to wade through, I can't determine what's true. Therefore, I don't care. I'm just not going to look into it. I don't know. So, that's harmful to legitimate researchers who are trying to expose these real abuses that happen, because many of the abuses, especially of MKUltra, are so sensational in themselves. The idea that we would hire prostitutes to drug unwitting victims with LSD or something,
it's real.
It sounds like the kind of thing that would be made up. So when there are a lot of other false claims out there that are just as sensational, it just seems like the kind of thing that would be false. So how should I actually believe this? Or maybe I should actually believe those things too, because this thing was so sensational. Maybe those are. So it muddies the waters of how do we actually determine what they did and what they didn't do. So I quote an intelligence officer in this book where he makes this point, basically saying it's in the CIA's best interest to facilitate these conspiracy theories by what he calls the kooks.
Yes.
The more kooks out there, the less people can actually wade through what actually did happen.
Yeah. Even when you look at people who haven't had something allegedly traumatic happen to them, like being an MKUltra experimentee or something like that, when you look at people online who doesn't even have to be a conspiracy or something, they just run with some sort of wild information, whatever it may be. And they know at the beginning, consciously, this is bullshit, right? But then they say it enough, just from behind a keyboard every day, as a part of a way to grift their way through this, that eventually, I've seen this enough online over the years through so many people, I think a lot of those people actually maybe make themselves mentally sick and actually do believe it after a while. So, what does that say about the people who have some sort of actual psychological trauma and then just believe other things happen to them? Like the possibilities with that are endless. What was that term you just used?
Censorship through noise?
Censorship. Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna use that. That's actually perfect, because that's exactly what it is. It's like, if you can have a way bigger crowd of people where you can't hear any of the individual voices, that's easier to control than the individual voice who's got a microphone.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lot easier to do that, to drown out the noise, than to try to silence all the noise.
Right.
You can't ever silence all the noise, but if we drown it out, then it doesn't matter if there's noise there in the first place.
Right.
Nobody's going to hear it.
All right, so the beginning of MKUltra history here. Let's go deep into this.
Okay,
We're gonna
yes.
go through this whole timeline, try to separate fact from fiction. And I know there's a lot of stuff, like in doing the research, it's like it's TBD. There's not enough there to be able to say this was this way or that way. So when that happens, no worries.
Although I do have a point about that.
Please.
Where I actually think we know a lot about MKUltra, a lot more than people kind of think we do.
Right.
There's this concept about MKUltra that in 1973, Sidney Gottlieb, the head, he destroyed most of the files.
That's nice of him.
Yeah, so
right before the Church Commission.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if people know about MKUltra, sometimes, they've heard this story about Sidney Gottlieb destroyed these files, and so we can't really know what it was. But I kind of have the opposite opinion after looking at all this. I think we can have a really good idea about what it was. He destroyed a lot of the files, which would have been great to have, but at the same time, we've recovered thousands of files that he didn't destroy that we know. And since then, there were a lot of lawsuits that you had all these depositions I found, thousands of pages. There were the Church Committee investigations, the Pike Committee investigations in the House. Yes. There was the Rockefeller Commission, which uncovered some stuff. There have been institutional records that have been released. There have been government reports that have been. It's like to me, it's like we almost have more documentation of MKUltra than like any other secret project I can think of.
I should have said that better. It may be the dwarf among midgets with things we look at as far as having information. We do have a lot of information about it. Obviously, you've done the research and uncovered stuff. But I'm saying since files on anything like this always get destroyed.
Yes.
There's always stuff lost to history and exact stories and who were the exact victims and stuff like that we can't know. It's not like there was a Truman Show taping all this and we can go watch that on a loop and figure out what it is. But to your point, unlike other alleged things that maybe the CIA or other espionage organizations have been involved with where we can't really even point to that was the date it started, this is who was really involved, because we literally have no files. This one we do.
Yes.
And they had to over the years, obviously through litigation, basically admit that this existed and this is a real thing. It's I mean, even if you pull up the CIA's greatest organization, Wikipedia, they have a page called MKUltra where they admit it. And the lady who wrote that at Langley and had everyone, I'm kidding right now, obviously, but you know what I mean.
The CIA for a while it had its own internal Wikipedia, Intellipedia.
Internal,
yeah.
I think it's external now too.
It was like an internal system to be able to have this open source ability for people, for people who have the designated clearance to be able to write about a particular topic. So, you could write something and say you have top secret clearance, then you could, make it top secret, and then whoever has that clearance will be able to log on and see that information. So it's called Intellipedia. And
You're not helping right now.
Yeah, they had an article on MKUltra, and it's since been declassified, and it doesn't say anything really that that's not in the public domain, that hadn't been in the public domain before that. But it was a pretty cool experiment, I guess, to have this crowdsourced information for intelligence things within the CIA. I don't know what happened to it exactly, but it didn't get going too far. I think it ended after a few years.
Can you imagine just being like Linda at Langley? You put in 21 years so far to desk. The best thing you get to do is watch footage of some drone that just blew up a fucking wedding halfway around the world. But one day you come across this file that says top secret, but now it's declassified, and you're like, oh, that would be perfect for the page. You just type in MKUltra. We mind controlled people through fucking LSD and then burned all the files. Click! And then it's just, oh yeah, that's our internal little system. What a world.
Yeah.
What a world. All the I would just love to be a fly on the wall in CIA whenever they have those meetings where they're like, this is all the shit we're never going to be able to talk about. So, you walk in this room, it's like the closed skiff or whatever. They're like, here's the aliens or whatever.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to be
I'm
in
sure,
that room.
especially at the highest levels, that kind of thing takes place where, okay, we need a rundown of what are the major, secret operations that are going on right now. However, one of the problems with the structure of the CIA, which is an inherent flaw, it's not like it can get beyond this to a degree, is that it is so heavily compartmentalized that even if you work within the CIA, you don't know what's going on in the CIA.
Yes.
So with MKUltra, there might have been a dozen people who knew this was going on. I think in an organization
that's it?
Maybe.
Wow.
I mean, you have Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, John Gittinger, and several other chemists who are working on this. There aren't that many other people who are involved with this.
That's an amazing point too, because there could even be people who were tasked with one little bullshit thing that has no context. They're like, hey, can you just tell me what this chemical is right here? They fucking type it in their report, give it to somebody, and then that's used, and they have no idea what that's used for.
So I mentioned toward the end of the books, what are some of the structural flaws of the CIA that enabled something so abusive to happen like MKUltra? And that's one of them. The heavily compartmentalized nature of the organization means that there are few internal checks, because who can be able to check this if nobody can know about it? Right. That's supposed to be the purpose of the Inspector General. The CIA Inspector General should have the ability to see what's going on and stop it if it's illegal or unethical. There were several Inspector General investigations into MKUltra, one in 1957, one in 1963. The one in 1963, the Inspector General, John Ehrman, he said, "I think this is illegal and unethical," and yet he didn't stop it. One of the reasons why later,
I wonder why.
There was another Inspector General, Lyman Kirkpatrick, and he wrote the report in 1957. He says, "I was afraid to lose my job. You know, if I recommended that this stop or something." So he said, "I was just trying to see what the limits were that I could do and not lose my job." You know, so the Inspector General was impotent. The heavily compartmentalized nature of the CIA prevented that, and then the bad record-keeping practices prevented anyone from kind of following the paper trail. So Sidney Gottlieb destroys the files. So all these kind of internal checks that were supposed to be there failed. So you have to then rely on external oversight of the intelligence community, which falls to Congress, but that basically didn't exist throughout much of the Cold War. So, okay, if there's no external oversight, then you kind of have plausible deniability to do anything you want.
You think you're gonna spy on the spies? That's what I always ask. I'm like, okay, you think this asshole in Congress who's taking money under the table openly at like the steakhouse down the street is going to be able to hold anything over these spies who are trained to spot things like that? Like, not to be overly cynical, but, you know, there's a reason why Frank Church lost his election immediately after the church committee or commission, whatever the term is. And it's like, you know, I don't, you can justify a lot of the compartmentalized or uncompartmentalized. You can justify a lot of things to yourself with the right intentions in the name of national security. And that can be the road to hell where you're doing bad things, and you don't. It's like people want to make this simple and be like, that's just because they're evil and they know they're. It's not that simple. It's just human fallacy. You think you're doing the right thing, and if we got to cut this corner right, it'll be worth it. And that's the nature of what it is. But your point about compartmentalization is perfect, and it's something that every guy I've had in here who either, you know, reports on CIA or the government or has been within it, they all say the same thing. It's like it's a need-to-know basis, and that allows you to do your job without thinking about the millions of pieces in the picture. Even Shawnee Delaney, who was in here, who was DIA, right? She she spent a lot of time in Afghanistan in the years leading up to bin Laden, and she was actually an integral person in the hunt for bin Laden. But she knew that, but she didn't know the specifics of it, because the way they did the bin Laden hunt was there was basically a central resource that you uploaded your information to, and you saw no other information that was going in there. You had no idea whether what you just uploaded they could quickly vet and be like, hey, nice job getting that, but that's not anything. Or if it's like, holy shit, that's big, that connects to this other puzzle piece over here. So, I mean...
Well, the reason why I say it's an inherent flaw of the intelligence community that there's this compartmentalization, because you have to have it to some degree.
Yes.
Secrets have to be kept. I mean, there are legitimate secrets of national security that can't get out. So you do have to have that in some degree. One of the prime examples of where this can go wrong, at least from the perspective of the CIA, would be like the family jewels, you know, that are released. This is a...
Can you tell people about this?
Yes,
We've talked about it before.
This is a document that's compiled together. Schlesinger, that's a hard name to say. James Schlesinger, I think that was his name. He was the director of the CIA. I think maybe this was like the late 60s, early 70s. And he and William Colby, who was kind of his deputy under him, who eventually replaced him, they had this idea that we should compile all of the skeletons in our closet, in the CIA's closet. That way we can get ahead of any news stories that might come out, you know, because one of the things that prompted them to do this is Seymour Hersh contacted them about Project Azorian, which was an attempt by the U.S., by the CIA, to get a ship and go to the middle of the ocean and drop a giant claw from it and retrieve a sunken Soviet submarine that had nuclear missiles on board, because we wanted to, you know, figure out what kind of their technology was. And so Seymour Hersh figured out that this was going on. So he told them, I'm going to publish this story. And William Colby was able to kind of negotiate with him. Can you delay it a little bit longer, whatever? And so after that, Colby and Schlesinger realized that we need to figure out like what other ticking time bombs there are in the CIA so that we can either prevent them from getting out or whatever. So they send out a directive to all past and present CIA personnel, whether you were a janitor or a secret agent or whatever, and they say, if you were involved in anything illegal during your time here, can you tell us like what it was? So they compiled this huge document, you know, it's called The Family Jewels, and it leaked to Seymour Hersh. So, you know, that's the opposite of compartmentalization. We're going to compile all this in one place, and that's where it goes wrong from the intelligence perspective, because it's like, well, now that it's all in one place, it makes it so easy to get into the wrong hands. Schlesinger instituted this purge of personnel at the CIA. He started firing everybody, and one of these disgruntled personnel just gave it to Seymour Hersh, or a chunk of it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so
that's
that's why you do
learned.
need compartmentalization, because you want to prevent something like that from happening if there are legitimate secrets of national security you're holding. But at the same time, it's a delicate balance of.
It's a very delicate balance, and it's like, it's easy to look at all the bad shit CIA has done, and there's a long list of that, and want to say disband it, get rid of it. I have to be a realist though, which is to say, yeah, if we didn't have a spy organization in America for 3 days, there'd be a problem, right? So, you also don't want to be a bootlicker and be like, therefore, let them do what they do. I think that's fucking crazy. But it's always like the buck is going to stop somewhere. And whoever controls that buck is going to have flaws. And I think because of the nature of what they do and the reaches of these people, it's like they're there forever sometimes. They're there for 30, 40 years, or they're there for 7, and then they walk out to get their paycheck in the private sector and immediately walk in the office on Monday with their own desks. Now they just work for Lockheed Martin, but they're ready to, you know what I mean? So it's like a revolving door of private and public sector within this very secret organizations, like not just CIA, whether it be Pentagon or NSA, all that stuff, that's constantly like just slushing around with all this talent and information and compartmentalization and national security, that there are going to be times where that gets bastardized. And, we've unfortunately seen it over and over again. MKUltra was kind of from the very beginning, though. It was like the ultimate warning of, all right, this is how bad it could get.
And secrecy kind of breeds secrecy.
Yes.
So once you grant an agency some amount of secrecy, it's very difficult for it not to assume even more. In the book, I call this the vicious cycle of secrecy. For me, the cycle seems to be, you start with secrecy, it's granted. Secrecy leads to plausible deniability, because if nobody can really know what you're up to, well, then you're not really accountable to anyone. So once you have plausible deniability, that often leads to risky behavior, something like MKUltra. You start doing something that you wouldn't otherwise have because you have that plausible deniability. So secrecy leads to plausible deniability leads to risky behavior. Risky behavior in many cases leads to embarrassment. You're going to get found out. Seymour Hersh is going to get the copy of the family jewels, and he's going to publish it on the front page of the New York Times. And embarrassment leads to secrecy. Now our secrets got out there. We need to clamp down and really make sure they don't anymore. Okay, now you start the cycle again. Now you have secrecy, plausible deniability, and so on.
Crazy, man. Yeah, this is one of those I think about at night a lot. It's just like I don't, it's easy to spot problems. It's hard to find solutions, right? And I don't like just being one of those guys saying that's a problem. Someone else figure it out. I can't say I have a really great solution there. Like if suddenly every single thing we were doing from an espionage perspective had to actually, not just in theory, but quite literally without any obstruction, be overseen by Congress, that'd be a disaster. But at the same time, when you don't oversee it, it could be a disaster. It's like, oh, which way do we go?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
I was going to say there were some reforms instituted to try to bulk up external secrecy of the intelligence community, especially after 1975. The Church Committee was exposing these past abuses. Some of that was, okay, the president should have to sign off on covert actions, so that eliminates his or her plausible deniability. Okay, so, the president if you have to sign off on a covert action, now you're inextricably linked to this thing now. So that's one way to try to reduce the plausible deniability in that vicious cycle. Another was to create specific committees within Congress, to monitor the intelligence community. But that didn't work out too well for a while. There are some people who said it was more akin to like whining and dining sessions. So like the CIA was required to inform these committees on what it was doing a certain number of times a year. And when they would get together, they would really just kind of wine and dine them and, whatever. And they meet like once a year and that was it.
Yeah. But also like it humanizes everything too. So you're like, I know Jeff.
Yeah.
Jeff would never do that. Jeff's out there like fucking sticking a syringe in like some fucking Filipino child. Like, it's just for national security.
Yeah. So I think I think you have to incentivize Congress to actually want to be the watchdog. How to do that is difficult, but I think it has to do something with realigning the incentives of elections, whether it be a different kind of voting like ranked choice voting or proportional representation or ending gerrymandering or something. Right. If you can realign the incentives of the elected representatives to actually care more about governance than getting reelected, or that's always going to be important, but to care more about governance maybe.
Right.
So if you can realign those incentives somehow, then I feel like that's at least the avenue that I see that you can try to have a stronger external check on the CIA. But other than that, I'm not sure. A strong free press and free speech.
Yeah.
William Colby said, he was eventually became director of the CIA. He was asked, what keeps you from abusing people like me? Some reporter asked him, and he said, it's the external checks, it's Congress, these congressional committees, and he said, and the press. So it's like the press exposing these abuses, the ability for them to speak truth to power, an integral part of that vicious cycle of secrecy, or something that can try to help stop it, is the embarrassment portion.
Portion?
Whenever some abuse happens and it can be exposed, it should be exposed. You should be able to expose something when that was illegal or whatever. So that it plays on a check of the intelligence community.
They know how to play that game though really well. I mean, a friend of mine's John Kiriakou, who's been in here. We've done 4 episodes, but he was here twice, and we just did 2 episodes each time. You familiar with his story?
No, I'm not.
So John was a high-level CIA guy. Like very high level. He eventually, towards the end of his career, was the guy who led the mission that got Abu Zubaydah in early 2002, right after 9/11, who was at the time believed to be the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. And, when in 1991, he was the chief historian for CIA on Saddam Hussein. He's like briefing H.W. Bush before we go into Desert Storm. So the guy, his story's insane. But he leaves CIA, and I want to say like 05, 06, something like that. And towards the end of his time at CIA, obviously, was the post 9/11 era. And one of the things they instituted right away, as you know, is the enhanced interrogation program. So someone comes up to him as a high-level guy after they secretly instituted this program and said, hey, we got this new program. It's called enhanced interrogation. We want to train you on it so that you can be one of the guys. And John looked at it and said, this is torture. And they're like, well, no, it's enhanced. He's like, no, this is not constitutional. It's torture. So behind the scenes, they would call him in the hallways at Langley like the human rights guy, which was not a compliment to him. But fast forward in 07, and there's a whole backstory with this that makes it even worse. But Bush administration is obviously just burning out at that time. Press is all over them. And they're at war with CIA over whose idea this was to do enhanced interrogation. And so John gets wind that they are going to try to pin the enhanced interrogation on him when he was like the one guy actually fighting against it. So instead of turning on those people, he goes and does an interview with ABC where he actually, even though he knew it didn't work and didn't support it, he defended them and said, oh, we got so much information from the enhanced interrogation program, like these are patriots, whatever. And long story short, 5 years later, illegally, actually, like how it happened. They have all the emails, but they reopened a case into him. It was an old rival from CIA, instructed Eric Holder to reopen a case. Holder didn't want to do it. He said, no, please open the case. They did. John ends up going to jail, taking a plea deal for 2 years, and becomes a total dissident, obviously. But, he talks about how the press is actually something that they can totally manipulate because they can give them a sacrificial lamb and change the narrative of the story, or give them something far more simple. Another guy I've had in, Joby Warrick. Are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not.
Joby's a Pulitzer winner, been the national security reporter for the Washington Post forever, written several books, great guy. But he the very first time he was in here, he's been in here 3 times, but episode 134, like he talks about this. It was like 50 minutes in that podcast. He was like, there's a difficult thing that happens where we'll work on a story, get it all the way towards the finish line, be talking to people, and then we'll get a call from our friends, right? Because you know these guys, you're friendly with them at CIA or wherever it is, and they're like, hey, you guys are on the right path here, but if you report this, fucking 150 people are going to die. Here's why. Here's how. Please don't do that. And he says, we then have to go into a conference room, just a bunch of human beings, and ask ourselves to play the guessing game of, are they just fucking with us because they don't want this out? Or is this real, and are we going to have blood on our hands? And that is not a conversation that I would be envious of, having to have.
Yeah, there are a couple instances in this book where that kind of thing happens. I mentioned Seymour Hersh. William Colby personally asked him, can you delay the story on Project Azorian? There's another instance where Gerald Ford, President Ford, is meeting with some editors of the New York Times, and he accidentally lets slip that the CIA might have been involved in assassinations. Because they ask him, well, what other skeletons are in the CIA's closet? And he says, oh, I don't know, stuff like assassinations. And as soon as he says it, he says, that's off the record. And so the editors kind of meet afterwards, and they feel like they have a moral obligation to not go to press with it, and so they stay quiet for a while. But one of them lets it slip to a CBS News reporter whose name I'm blanking on, and then he eventually airs the story on TV, and then it becomes a big deal. Yeah, so there are a couple instances in this book where, the editors at least had to make some kind of decision: should we do this or not?
It's a strange world, the whole off-record thing. Did you run into that just like writing the book and talking with people and interviewing them? Did you run into some where some guys are like, "Hey, this part's off record"?
No, I didn't, because basically all these people are dead. So I didn't. Well, it's helpful in the sense that I don't have that dilemma, but it's unhelpful in the sense that I want to talk to them. I want to get more information. So yeah, Sidney Gottlieb died 20 some odd years ago.
Someone's granddaughter calls you up like, "Why'd you do? Fuck your grandpa, he's dead."
Well, I'm happy to say, at least for my first book, The Dirty Tricks Department, Stanley Lovell, that guy in the OSS, I mean, he's long dead, but I interviewed his grandkids before the book, and afterwards they wrote back to me saying, we really like the book. And I thought, I'm glad they enjoyed it.
Cool.
It's not as if I changed the book because I wanted to please them. Right. I interviewed them and I wrote the book, but they enjoyed the book and they thought it was an accurate representation of who he was. And I thought, oh, good.
Yeah, it's like, what's the tone? I haven't read it yet, obviously, but like, you look at anything in that type of scenario, it's like, well, what tone do you take? Are you trying to be like scathing for the sake of being scathing, or are you reporting the facts as you found them, and where that lands, it lands? And I think a lot of people, especially people who aren't directly involved, like they can respect that. I've heard those stories before.
And I especially think with this Project Mind Control, this second book, Sidney Gottlieb, I'm not out to denigrate Sidney Gottlieb. I think he did a lot of unethical things, and I think a lot of what MKUltra did was unethical, but I think he really was having moral dilemmas about what he was doing, especially after he was done with it. And I think he did think this was in the best interest of the country, and hey, this is for the greater good. The ends justify the means. I've got to do this. Right. I don't think he was a particularly sadistic individual, but I think he did some sadistic things. Now, that being said, I do think there are at least one character in particular in this book who was just out to do it for the fun, and who was sadistic. His name is George White. White. He was in charge of Operation Midnight Climax. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, okay. But can you please refresh our audience on Midnight Climax?
Yes. Sidney Gottlieb hires George White to basically run these safe houses. One is in New York, and then it quickly shifts to San Francisco. He has a couple there. And at these safe houses, he would, especially in San Francisco, hire prostitutes to slip LSD to their unwitting clients while George White is watching behind a one-way window. Yep. One-way mirror, seeing what's happening, and he's recording it, sitting on a toilet that he has, a portable toilet that he bought, drinking liquor martinis that he bought off CIA funds. So that's, what he's doing. The idea is we want to determine whether this is a kind of truth drug. Can we give this drug to people who obviously have secrets to spill, and will it make these people spill their secrets? So that's the kind of the purpose of Midnight Climax.
Was he often the only other one on the other side of that window, or
there was one of his accomplices is a guy named Ike Feldman. Okay, and he's probably the most colorful character in the entire book. He's got some there. He's passed away now, but there was a guy who did an interview with him, and the quotes he has are just insane. What do you say? He's talking about how I always wanted to be a pimp and a heroin dealer, and so I finally got to work with these prostitutes and blah, blah. He just goes on and on talking about all this crazy stuff.
See, something's almost like sociopathic there.
Yeah. So George White, he's in it for the fun, I think. I mean, after MKUltra ended, Operation Midnight Climax, his subproject, he wrote a letter to Sidney Gottlieb, and here it is verbatim. He said, I toiled in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?
With the sanction and blessing of the All-High. Yeah, he's a sociopath.
Yeah, but he was also really into the sex scene in San Francisco, and so he was drugging people to try to get them to join in orgies with him. And
well, that was the question I was going to ask. I'm not asking this to be funny, but the guys like this, like Ike Feldman and what was it, George White?
Yes.
You mentioned he's like on a toilet on the other side sometimes drinking liquor. Like, is there any evidence to show that there was also like a sexual proclivity maybe involved with them wanting to do this type of experiment that was driving that?
I don't know if I don't know if he ever did anything sexual with the people in the other room.
We're watching them. You know how it is.
I'm sure.
No
I'm sure.
diddy.
Yeah, watching them, I'm sure there's something to that. Again, it's not like I don't know, but based on the personality of who I think George White was, I'm sure that's some kind of component. One of his friends, who is in like the adult scene, said of George White that he would often hire, prostitutes to wear high heels because he had this high heel fetish, and they would whip him on the bed and all kinds of stuff. And he would try to get people to join into orgies with him by giving them LSD. One of these women named Clarice Stein, she and her friend were over at a party at George White's. Her husband had previously been at these parties, but he was away on a business trip, and she had her like baby with her that she had brought just to stop by and say hi to everyone. He dosed her with LSD, and she kind of went into this manic state. She ended up going home. And she had like this psychotic break. She calls George White on the phone asking kind of, what's going on with me? Something's happening. And he says, you'll get over it. And she eventually gets committed to a psychiatric institution. She lives with her parents for a while. Her husband comes back from this trip and she's a different person. She's cowering in the corner of the room, doesn't know what's going on. She ends up committed to the psychiatric institute where she has electroshock therapy done to her and all kinds of stuff. God. And she ends up dying. I think it's right before the church committee exposes that this kind of thing was going on, so she never really learned what was happening. Right after the church committee, there was something set up called the Victims Task Force that tried to find the unwitting victims of George White's drug experiments, and they identified several people and told them what had happened to them so that they would have the opportunity to sue the CIA, and she died right before that, so she never learned what happened.
Yeah, that's not fishy at all. Died right before. That's the thing. Like, there's a lot of people who die right before they're going to say something when it involves this stuff, and you're not a tinfoil hat person to be like, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, fucks like a duck. It's usually a duck. You know what I mean? Like, that's what's really frustrating. I understand that when you get embarrassed and some things are coming out of the hopper, like, that you don't want, you want to try to cover that up, but like, you're also just perpetuating that narrative over the years. Like, it's just kicking the can down the road when people disappear. Once in a while, yeah, I'm sure someone actually goes nuts and from what happened to him and does die. But like, every time you see one of these cases, she just like, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who's been fucking talking to everyone for the last 6 years, 7 years, longer than that. She just committed suicide. No worries. We didn't get the Epstein files a few months ago, like they said. They keep saying they're going to put them out, and she just commits suicide. She got hit by a bus before that, like just coincidentally a month before. That didn't finish the job. So now she killed herself. Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.